Happy New Year. So today is a big day for me. It is actually, hi Tiffany, it is actually my birthday, my true birthday, and I'm going to tell you my own origin story in a minute. But it's also, let me just turn up the volume here. It's also my first day out of quarantine. I had COVID for the new year, went to Jamaica over the holidays, and we all came back sick. So my day zero was just before the new year. And I am officially, I think I was really out of quarantine yesterday, but give it an extra day to be on the safe side. So I'm officially out. I'm not really going anywhere, but it is nice to know that I can, hop on over to the supermarket if I need to. So let me just share with you very briefly my hilarious origin story before we talk about the origins of the microbiome. I was conceived in Scotland, in Edinburgh. My dad, who is an orthopedic surgeon, now retired, was doing his orthopedic training there. And my mother, I have an older brother and sister, and my mom was in Jamaica, and she decided to come up for a conjugal visit to see her husband. And when she came to visit, I had a sister and a brother. They really weren't planning on having any more children, but my dad was too shy to go out and buy prophylactics, shall we say, at the time in Edinburgh. So they just winged it, and hello, this is what happened. This is why you must use birth control if you're trying to prevent pregnancy, but I'm actually really glad that they didn't. And that's my origin story. So let's just see what's happening. Oh, happy birthday to me. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tiffany. So now that I've shared my embarrassing origin story with you, let's talk about the origin of the microbiome. It is really fascinating how all of this works. And I'll tell you, before you are even born, your microbiome starts getting prepared by your pregnant mother. So this is how this works. And honestly, if you were to get 10 of the smartest software designers and engineers together, I don't think they could come up with something that works quite this well. So even before you're born, when your mother is pregnant, early in the pregnancy, cells that are lining the vagina that produce glycogen start to ramp up production of glycogen. Why do they do that? Because they want to increase the population of a particular bacteria that's found in the vagina called lactobacillus. And lactobacillus, unlike the gut where diversity is key, in the vagina, it's really sort of a monoculture ideally. So the vaginal microflora is dominated by lactobacillus. So these cells in the lining of the vagina ramp up production of glycogen. Glycogen feeds the lactobacillus, so the population really expands. And lactobacillus breaks down carbohydrates into lactic acid. And that lactic acid creates an acidic environment in the vagina that repels any viral invaders, any bacterial invaders. So group B strep or herpes or HIV, beware, because of this acidic environment. So that acidic environment is actually designed to keep you, me, the fetus, safe during pregnancy. So that's the first thing that happens. Second thing that happens that's sort of microbially related, that is really fascinating, that happens a little later in pregnancy. In the third trimester, two particular families of bacteria, actinobacteria and proteobacteria in the mom, and so in the pregnant mom, increase their production. And they create a situation microbially so that the mother's blood sugar goes up. That's why some people end up flunking their glucose tolerance test during pregnancy. Sometimes it's because you're eating too many cookies, but there's an increase in production of glucose. It raises a mother's blood sugar and it increases deposition of fat in the breasts. And that is to make sure, remember, this is third trimester pregnancy. That's to make sure that when the baby's born, there's adequate milk production, because remember, milk is really a sugar. There's adequate milk production. So increases fatty deposition in the breast, increases blood glucose. And so that, again, is mediated by bacteria. How do we know that? Because when we transplant bacteria from pregnant women into mice, this is what happens. They get more fatty deposition of fatty tissue in the breasts, and their blood sugar goes up. So this is not hormonal. This is actually bacterial. So basically, your pregnant mom and her vagina and breasts are getting ready for your arrival with all these different changes that are microbially mediated. So let's talk about birth. People think that their first year of school is the most important, or maybe their first year of marriage or med school, whatever it is. But I'm here to tell you, the most important moment in your life is actually as you're being born, because that informs a lot of what comes after. Now, I had the benefit of being born vaginally, but my daughter was a C-section baby. And, I'm here to tell you these things can be overcome. But if you are somebody who is considering conception, or somebody who is, maybe you have children who may be considering conception, this is something that I want to make sure that you are aware of so that you can educate them about. There is a tremendous difference between a vaginal birth and a C-section. And don't get me wrong, C-sections save lives every day. They, when there's fetal distress or, babies breach or whatever, but there's also no question that they are overdone. Almost 1 in 4, between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 births in the US are now done by C-section. And while some of that is medically indicated, clearly there is a big piece in there that is commerce and convenience. And it wouldn't be such a problem, except that C-sections, in addition to the complications of bleeding and surgical infection, et cetera, C-sections really change the microbiome. And here's why. When the baby is being born, if you've ever participated, maybe when you're giving birth, you're sort of paying attention to other things, but if you ever watched a birth or delivered a baby, I've delivered about 3 dozen of them. One of the things you notice is that as a baby's head is coming through the birth canal, as it crowns, it turns posteriorly, and the baby's head turns so that the face faces the mother's tush. That area between the vagina and the rectum that we call the perineum is what it turns to face. And why does it do that? It does that so that the baby can swallow a mouthful of microbes, can basically immerse its face in that sort of, we think of it as kind of an icky area between the vagina and the rectum, but that area is a microbially rich area, the perineum, and the baby is basically getting colonized with those important microbes. And here's a really startling fact. Babies that are born via C-section, instead of being colonized with a mother's healthy bifidobacterium, they're colonized with hospital-acquired staph. So you may think, well, that's not a big deal. I have staph versus bifido, who cares? Well, the problem is that C-section colonization is associated with an increased risk of allergies, of asthma, of obesity, and of autoimmune diseases. And that risk follows you through for a significant amount of your life. So this isn't just, when you're thinking, oh, well, it'd be so convenient to have the baby at this time and, have a baby before the new year and get a tax exemption. No, you have to really think about what's going on medically and the difference between a vaginal birth and a C-section birth. So if your C-section delivery is indicated medically, fine, right? If this has to happen, but you sometimes have to push a little bit and make sure, because it's sort of shocking. Like, a lot of OBGYNs don't really seem hip to this idea that there are significant differences microbially. So again, it is really a big difference, and not a difference that, yes, you can make it up in some ways, but one of the problems too is when a baby is born, they tend to typically kind of sterilize a baby, right? They take the baby and they kind of wipe the baby down with all this hexadine and stuff, these antibacterials, whereas we ideally shouldn't be doing that. We want the baby to, we want all those microbes that the baby has been immersed in to get ingested and to colonize the baby. So I think that's another area where in hospitals, we don't get it exactly right. We're busy like cleaning up and removing all those microbes. The other really big difference is between breastfed babies and formula-fed babies. And if you've participated in these office hours, you've heard me talk about this before. And I remember my experience as a medical student at Columbia going into doing my pediatrics rotation. And at the time it was a building called Babies Hospital. And I remember seeing these signs in the clinic about breastfeeding, these signs that were put up by La Leche, the international organization that promotes breastfeeding. And these signs were saying, breastfed babies have lower rates of Crohn's disease. And I remember thinking, how is that even possible? What does breastfeeding have to do with Crohn's disease? And I literally remember thinking, oh, these La Leche people and their propaganda. Well, it turns out, of course, they're absolutely right. We do know that just like a vaginal delivery, nursing is associated with lower rates of autoimmune diseases. So let's talk about specifically breastfeeding and the microbiome. The third most common ingredient in breast milk is something called an HMO, human milk oligosaccharide. And HMOs are completely indigestible by babies because they're not there to actually feed the baby. They're there to feed the baby's bifidobacteria. And as they feed the baby's bifidobacteria, what that does is it helps grow that population, and that helps to the baby to be able to fight things like staph and other common pathogens that are on the mother's nipple during nursing. So it's just fortifying the baby's microbial army, right? And while that is happening, the baby is also, the lactobacillus and other bacteria in the baby's gut are feeding on the milk sugars in breast milk. So it's all very synergistic. And again, we see, it's not just that like, yeah, this sounds like a good idea. This is the way nature intended. We see scientifically that there is data to really support the differences in terms of disease expression later on in life. And of course, disease expression is a complicated concept. There's genetic predisposition, there's environmental triggers, but there are also innate things like whether you were born vaginal, whether you were breastfed or not, that can end up triggering something that you may or may not be genetically predisposed to. So so we went through pregnancy with the glycogen and the lactobacillus. We went through vaginal versus C-section delivery. We went through breastfeeding. Let's talk about the early years, toddlerhood. One of the things you see if you observe babies or if you've raised a couple is that they like to be on the ground and they like to put things in their mouth. And we're constantly, you know, the old adage, first baby, like something falls on the floor, you take it, you sterilize it. Second baby, you wipe it off. Third baby, you just give it right back to them. Well, it's a third baby way of raising that we probably should be doing. I mean, within reason, right? You don't want to have your kid eating something that's totally filthy. But the truth is that the reason babies interact with things so much is that is how their microbiome internally interacts with the external environment. And that's how they continue to cultivate microbes. So for example, there's really fascinating data that kids who grow up in a house with pets, with dogs in particular, have fewer allergies and fewer coughs and colds and lower rates of antibiotic use because the dogs are bringing more dirt into the environment and the kids are typically absorbing some of that dirt. So we need interaction with germs in order to have a healthy immune system and a healthy microbiome. And kids we see these same statistics. If we look at autoimmune diseases like Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, the two I treat, we see higher rates of autoimmune disease with urbanity, with people who live in an urban environment versus rurality, people who live in a rural environment, and even visits to farms where kids interact with animals and get a little dirty can be protective against some of these autoimmune diseases. If we look at rates of asthma, for example, highest in cities where there's a lot of concrete and glass. And if we culture the skin microbes in cities versus in the country, we see that people who live in cities, there's a direct proportionality between the amount of pathologic staph species on our skin and living in cities. So, you know, again, the idea isn't necessarily that you need to pack up and move to the country, although that would be quite fine. But the idea is, how can you rewild yourself even within an urban environment? And even more importantly, how can you rewild your kids? So there's a fantastic book. It's either on the shelf behind me or upstairs in my office. It's called Last Child in the Woods, Nature Deficit Disorder. And it's just a fantastic book. And it, you know, basically talks about the fact that none of these kids are sort of out in nature anymore. They're all inside in the glass and concrete on devices and so on. And while some of that is fine, it's also creating disruptive microbial problems within their microbiome because they're too clean and they're too sterile and they're inside all the time and they're not interacting with microbes out in nature. Because when you think about it, where do we get our microbes after we're born? We get them from the environment and primarily from soil. So if we're eating a lot of packaged processed foods that's grown in warehouses, the sort of factory foods, right? And we're not getting outside and interacting with nature and getting soil microbes, we're really not getting the ongoing microbial exposure that we need to have a healthy microbiome. So these are just some important points. And I tell people, even if you just get outside and sit in the grass, hug a tree, that kind of thing. I'm going for a long birthday hike in the freezing cold later this afternoon, but it is really, really critically important that we continue to have that interaction with nature. So it's not just about taking a probiotic. In fact, it's really not about taking a probiotic at all. It's about making sure we're eating food that is microbially rich, which typically means food that's grown locally within, within 10 or 20 miles of where you live. Because if you're eating food that's come over on a boat or plane from thousands of miles away, those microbes are all dead. So you want food that is locally grown, that's microbially rich, that's ideally not grown without pesticides, et cetera, even if it doesn't have the official organic moniker, but food that is not grown with chemicals, and food that's grown in microbially rich soil, right? That is critically important. And I like to talk about the fact that when I go to the farmer's market and I get the produce, the carrots are all kind of gnarly looking and there's dirt on them and they're all different lengths and stuff. And that's how they're supposed to look. And when I go to the supermarket and each carrot is exactly, 3.7 inches and a perfect orange color and there's no dirt, that makes me really concerned about what exactly it is I'm eating and about, we think about the nutrient richness, but you also have to think about the microbial richness of the food. So I'm going to take a break and see if we have any comments. Thank you, Cynthia. So I was born vaginally only 2 days into the 3rd trimester. Wow, I am so glad that you made it, Jennifer. I've heard that I didn't get the benefit of that vaginal bath of microbes due to being born too early. How would my microbiome at birth compare to that of a baby born by a C-section? Well, the good thing here, Jennifer, is that you were born vaginally. So you were born very prematurely. And again, hooray that you made it and you're here with us. But the fact that you were born vaginally is a huge benefit compared to a premature baby that's also born via C-section, because really it's about your interaction with the mother's birth canal, right? I mean, your microbiome was probably not fully formed either, but you had that very fortunate interaction with your mother's birth canal. And so you did get the benefit of that vaginal bath because, her microbes were intact even though you were born early. So I would say, I don't have a super data-driven scientific answer for you, but I would say that your microbiome is, I don't want to say better, but you know what I mean, is in that sense was more optimized compared to a baby born via C-section. So good for you. My husband was born via C-section and he would always ask me, could he be recolonized? I'm like, no, that ship has sailed, honey. There's no way to get you back in there and recolonize you. Okay, from Vio. I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong. If someone was C-section, bottle fed and urbanized as a child, can we ever catch up or reclaim those lost microbes as an adult? Yes, you can. And here's the thing, you don't need a perfect microbiome. You just need one that functions well enough to keep you healthy. So, on paper, it may never look as pristine as somebody who was born vaginally and breastfed and, lives out in the Amazon or is with the Hadza tribe in Tanzania hunter-gathering, right? It may never look quite like that, but it doesn't have to, because our microbes are also adapted for our environment. So the basic things that you can still do, like exposure to nature, avoiding microbe depleting medications and practices, and eating fermented food and high fiber food can make a big difference. And of all of those things, I would say avoidance of the things that disrupt your microbiome, antibiotics at the top of the list, acid blockers a close second, steroids, all of those things. And even thinking about household products too, that are very harsh, that have a lot of chemicals in them. So the sort of more of a natural microbe-friendly environment you can surround yourself with your personal care products, and limiting these medications or avoiding them altogether, and the diet and some exposure to nature can make a tremendous difference. So if you didn't get it at birth, Cynthia, what do I think about supplementing with Infantis, which is a type of bacterial strain once we're into adulthood if we didn't get it at birth? There's no data that supplementing with a specific probiotic will reinforce your microbiome to the point where now it's normal. There's just no data for that. So it's the basis for these companies to sell, gazillions of dollars worth of products, but there really is no scientific basis for that. There is data for specific probiotic products for specific problems. So for example, there are products that we use for traveler's diarrhea. There are products we use for pouchitis in patients with colitis. There are products we use for necrotizing enterocolitis. It's a problem we see in infants. But there's zero data that the average healthy person taking a probiotic supplement will somehow replete them and get them to a normal microbiome. There is a lot of data for the food, and particularly the variety of food. I believe the magic number is 31 different plants a week, plant-based foods that make a huge difference in terms of increasing diversity in your microbiome. Okay, let's go over to the Q&A. Hi, Robin, namesake with different spelling. I thought I read a baby with a mom that has Crohn's or colitis that breastfeeds has a greater chance of getting Crohn's or colitis. Is that wrong? Yes, that's actually wrong, Robin. Now, Crohn's is not a genetic disease like Tay-Sachs or sickle cell. It's what we call familial. So like in a lot of autoimmune diseases, there is an increased incidence. It goes from about 4 per 100,000 live births to 7, the risk. But it's not a genetic disease. And actually having your baby vaginally and breastfeeding your baby decreases their risk of Crohn's. It doesn't increase it because Crohn's is not transmitted through breast milk. But what is transmitted through breast milk is immunity, antibodies, et cetera, and passive immunity for the baby. So actually reverse of what you were told. Hi, Kate. Vaginal seeding. Yes, I'm so glad you mentioned that for those who have to have a cesarean birth. I know Michael Pollan did this, and I've had a few doula clients try to do it as well. Oh, you're a birth doula. That's wonderful. If I were to have a do-over, I would so be having my baby at home with a doula. So good for you. So I'm so glad you mentioned that, Kate. And for those of you who might not know what that is, there is a great book called Missing Microbes written by Marty Blazer, who, when last I checked, he was the chairman of infectious diseases at NYU, but I'm not sure if he's still there. But he wrote this book, Missing Microbes, which I think is still one of the best books about the microbiome. And as I say, when an infectious disease doc raises a red flag and says we're using too many antibiotics, we should all be listening. And Marty Blazer's wife, whose name is Maria, if I get this right, Maria Domingo Belez, I believe. I know it's Domingo Belez is the last name, is a researcher on the microbiome. And she and others have pioneered this incredible, I mean, I just love this concept because it's so simple and it's so low tech. I'm a low tech person. You know, I just like to use a hand spiralizer instead of some big machine. If there's some simple, inexpensive way to do it, like let's do it that way. So this vaginal seeding that Kate is referring to is a simple technique where you basically take a piece of gauze, and obviously it doesn't have to be sterile because we're about to soak it in microbes for a C-section baby, and you just kind of lay it in that area, the perineum between the vagina and the rectum, down in the groin area, and you kind of soak up the maternal juices. And then when the baby is born, you just kind of pat the baby's head and face down with this sort of microbially soaked gauze. So you're trying to approximate that birth canal passage, baby swallowing a mouthful of microbes. Now, I have a whole section on this in my second book, The Microbiome Solution. I have a birth plan. This birth plan is a reason that all my OBGYN colleagues don't talk to me. They hate my birth plan. It is a bane of their existence. They're like, listen, we just want to do this C-section and get on with it. And now we have these patients coming in with your damn birth plan about all these things they want to avoid. And it's really annoying. But the birth plan, I wrote it because it's a birth plan I wish I had had. And I had known about when I was pregnant and having my baby. So sorry to all my OBGYN colleagues that it's very inconvenient, but it's important stuff. And in the birth plan, I talk about the vaginal seeding and I say, make sure that your medical team is aware of your plans to reseed, because they might just call security on you. Like, what are you doing dousing the baby with this dirty gauze? So this is something, full transparency, make sure whether it's a midwife or a doctor or whoever, nurse practitioner, your doula, make sure that they are aware and on board. And, you may have to show a medical article or two. They have lots of articles suggesting it's very helpful. They have some suggesting it's neutral. They have some suggesting it's problematic, but I think the evidence is overwhelmingly in favor. But again, this is not something, remember, they're taking that baby out and they're sterilizing your baby, right? With Physoderm or Hexadine or whatever it is. So now you're trying to dirty your baby up. That's going to be very confusing for them. And again, some education is a two-way process. So I really advise making sure that they understand what you're doing ahead of time. But thank you so much, Kate, for mentioning that. That was great. All right, what else do we have in the chat? What do I think of reheated foods or leftovers? Okay, that's a little far afield, Sylvia, of what we're talking about today, but I think they're fine in general. I think leftovers are fine. Just don't leave them in the freezer forever. I think like a month or so is probably good, depending on what the food is. So any more questions about our microbiome and where it all comes from and how we get it and what we can do to continue to rewild ourselves? Oh, the other thing I meant to talk to you about is the whole bathing thing. Is just, and again, I'm not advocating that like you don't bathe or use deodorant or anything like that, but don't overdo it. Yes. Like you don't have to, for example, hair, right? You're not out there rolling in mud. So you don't have to, when you wash your hair with shampoo and then you condition it again, you typically are removing a lot of the healthy oils that your scalp is creating. And this is a custom formula, right? Your scalp is creating it just for you based on your specific pH, etc. So you wash it all out and then you try and replace, sorry, there's a helicopter flying over. It's a little loud. Okay, there it's gone. So you wash out all those natural oils and then you try to replace them with a store-bought formula, right? But you've just removed all those oils. It doesn't really make sense. Or same thing, you wash your face with a harsh cleanser and you're washing it all the time and then you're putting an oil back on to try and moisturize your face. Just wash your face a little less. Because again, your body is custom producing a lot of these things, these oils and things that are exactly pH adjusted for your particular skin type, etc. So, no need. So for example, when I wake up in the morning, I typically don't wash my face because I don't know about you, but I've not been rolling around in mud in my bed. And maybe that would actually be a good idea for the microbes, but my bed's pretty clean. So I go to bed, I wake up and, if I'm not showering in the morning, I usually shower at night, there's not really a need for me to wash my face. I mean, you can wash your face to sort of wake yourself up, but to then cleanse and remove, my skin has worked hard overnight to produce all these oils, etc., to make my skin healthy. And I also don't want to remove all those microbes necessarily either. So, at some point it's fine to wash your face if it starts to feel a little oily. But, I notice people are doing a lot of cleansing in the morning and cleansing at night, and they're trying to put back on the very same oils that they're removing. So just, worth thinking about and paying a little attention to. All right, I think we have a couple more questions. Phyllis, about the book, do I have an estimated date when my new book will be released? Thank you so much, Phyllis. The book is called The Antiviral Gut. We haven't had this sort of official cover release and all of that because the due date now is not until about September of this year. Part of that is because I missed my deadline. I was a little bit late with the draft. And part of it is just the supply chain with literally paper and all of that, just like everything else is slowed down with manufacturing. Book production is slowed down too. So it's September, which seems like a long way away, but is really just around the corner. And I'm going to be having lots of fun antiviral gut activities around that time. So thank you for asking, Phyllis. Kate, would I share some of the papers of articles on vaginal seeding? Yes. So Kate, the best way to find those really is to Google stuff looking at Domingo Belez's vaginal seeding, because she's been the lead author on most of those publications. And a lot of the work she's actually done in Central and South America in some of the maternity clinics down there and obstetric clinics. So that's a good way to find a lot of her work. Okay, what else do we have? We have some good questions here in the chat. Okay. As adults, can we slowly increase the good microbes by getting into nature? Yes, absolutely, 100%. And we know that both in looking at people in urban areas when they take them out into rural areas and what happens to the microbiome, as well as comparing populations from urban areas and rural areas. So yes, 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 you absolutely can improve your microbiome by getting out in nature. And then the other part of your question, Tiffany, or is getting into nature more of a benefit for children? Well, it's certainly a benefit for children too. And, that's a complex question, because I think what you're getting at there is the fact that our microbiome is more static as we get older. We used to think that with kids, the microbiome was fully formed by about age 3, but it turns out that's about up to age 18 is really when there's still a lot of adjustments being made. And then as adults, our microbiome is more stable, which is both good and bad, right? It means that as an adult, if we didn't get a lot of antibiotics in childhood and we get a course of antibiotics, our microbiome will bounce back a little more stably than it would in a kid. But it also means it's a little harder to rewild ourselves as adults, although not impossible. So when you ask, is getting into nature more of a benefit for children? It is important benefit for children, but it's also very important for us too. And important for children just because our microbiome is still developing. Germaphobe, grew up in New York City and have Crohn's. Oh, well, I'm sorry about the Crohn's, and I'm not sure that we can draw a direct straight line between growing up in New York and being a germaphobe. But I will tell you, we do have very, very clear data that diseases like Crohn's disease are more common in certain demographics, and that tends to be urban versus rural. In the data that we have from the 50s and 60s and 70s, it correlated with higher socioeconomic brackets. That's not the case anymore, but there was an association there too. And some researchers thought that was a secondary association because there was more of a focus on sanitation and cleanliness in higher socioeconomic brackets. But that's, as I said, that data doesn't hold up anymore in the last few decades. And again, with Crohn's, it's a complex mix with genetic predisposition, as I said, but environmental triggers are pretty key. And so if we look at the chromosomes, if we look at the genetic basis for Crohn's, we know that the NOD2 gene, chromosome 16, was one of the first genetic loci, one of the first chromosome abnormalities that was recognized by Judy Cho at University of Chicago. And not that long ago, actually, that was in the 90s. And since then, we've identified in the medical community, in the scientific community, over 100 more different folks, what we call susceptibility loci, areas in the chromosomes, abnormalities that are associated with Crohn's. But here's an interesting thing, Tiffany. You can literally have multiple of these abnormalities. Without the environmental trigger, you are unlikely to get Crohn's. And so what are the environmental triggers we know about? Well, over the years, there have been dozens of them that people have theorized about, right? From in utero exposure to measles virus, ingredients in toothpaste, refrigeration. These are some of the things over the years that the scientific community considered may have been causative for Crohn's. Paratuberculosis bacteria that causes a disease called Johne's disease in cows. That was a big one. Well, it turns out that the environmental triggers can be many. It's not any of those things I mentioned, but for example, having a bacterial or viral illness can trigger it. And I see that a lot in my Crohn's patients. They go on spring break to Mexico, they're all normal, everybody gets sick, everybody recovers except for one person, and 6 months later, lo and behold, they're diagnosed with Crohn's or ulcerative colitis. So there can be an infectious trigger. And the way we think that works, Tiffany, is that that infectious episode knocks out a lot of your healthy microbes, right? That may be one way that that works. Another environmental trigger is being a picky eater. So kids who eat a very low fiber, highly processed diet, a lot of sugar, processed carbohydrates, meat, that diet is associated with, particularly in somebody who's genetically predisposed, to higher rates of Crohn's disease. And that's why, we have such valuable data from identical twin studies. So thank you to all the identical twins out there who have been participating in studies. Because we see that the concordance, meaning the likelihood of one twin has it, the other twin having it, is not even 50%. It's only about 40% for Crohn's disease with identical twins. And these are two individuals with the same genetic material, the identical genetic material, but different environmental exposures. So a predisposing infectious episode, we see that about 10% of the time with Crohn's. Diet, a highly processed Western diet, that's another predisposing event, and antibiotic use. So I've talked about this study before, this meta-analysis from Mount Sinai, where I did my GI fellowship, that looked at patients with Crohn's disease and what the predisposing events were. And they found that prior antibiotic use in childhood was a major predisposing event. And there've been studies from Canada that showed that also. That study was published in Gut in 2014, I believe. So studies in Canada showed the same thing in the pediatric group, that antibiotic use early in life was associated up to a triple the likelihood of developing Crohn's. And for every year of additional antibiotic use in childhood, the risk went up by about 7%, which is shocking, right? Particularly considering how so many pediatricians just hand out antibiotics like water. I definitely see the tide shifting. There's more general awareness now. And there's a famous study in the journal Pediatrics that showed that pediatricians prescribe antibiotics 62% of the time when they think the parent expects it, and only 7% when they don't. So I always say, be the kind of parent who lets it be known, I am not interested in an antibiotic for my child unless it's absolutely necessary, because there's a lot of gray zone with the prescribing. Okay, so thank you for sharing that. Via, why are kids picky eaters? Wouldn't nature favor kids who love veggies and high fiber foods? It's such a good question. But here's the thing, the baby's first food, breast milk, is all sugar, right? It's all milk sugar. And those sugars are broken down and fermented, etc. So the breast milk, kind of sets the tone a little bit, although again, it's a sort of natural sugar, it's not added sugar. And the problem is that after breast milk, the foods that are typically introduced early on tend to be all starchy, sugary foods. So they tend to be things like, Cheerios and tater tots and, stuff that is very, very starchy, and crackers and things like that. But we know, again, we have scientific data that palate can actually be influenced and shaped early on. So I was hanging out before the holidays with a couple, wonderful couple. He's a founder of a running group called DC Run Crew, and she's a yoga instructor and does all kinds of fabulous things. And they have a 2-year-old, and they were telling me that their 2-year-old loves vegetables. Their 2-year-old was at a party, their 2-year-old son, and there was a piñata, and all the candy fell, and he was just standing there like, oh, I don't want any of this. Like, where's the broccoli crowns? So they have fed him early on a diet with a lot of vegetables and so on, and not done a lot of the, typical kid foods. And his palate is such that that's what he wants to eat. And I see that with a lot of my friends and my patients' kids. It's really, what you introduce them to. So if you're giving them, the birthday parties are the worst. I remember when the birthday parties started in preschool, that really, kind of sets a tone. But if you're giving them a lot of things to eat at home that may be sweet, but are not that added sugar. So they're eating sweet potato, or they're eating corn, but they're not eating, gummy bears. And particularly helping them develop a palate for more savory and even bitter, that has to happen pretty early on. What I noticed with my daughter, and this was like something out of a movie, I would not have believed it if I hadn't experienced it myself. My daughter was about, how old was she? Maybe just around a year, maybe a year and a half. She developed rotavirus. I remember it so clearly. My husband was in Guam for work. And, if you've had small children, you know that when you're the only one at home, the key is to take them out and tire them out, right? So we hit the mall, and we were, out all day. I was like, I'm going to tire this baby out so she's going to go to bed and I can have some me time. And I'm pretty sure that we got the rotavirus in a Benetton store because she had to go to the bathroom. And I remember going to the bathroom in the store, and I just have a feeling that that's where she got it. But anyway, she was very sick, and her rotavirus was more vomiting than anything else. And I took her to one of those urgent care places that night, and they said she had an air infection. I was very skeptical, and of course wanted to give her antibiotics. And again, I hadn't had my moment yet then of realizing how bad all this stuff was, but she just kept vomiting and she was really listless. And I ended up taking her to the emergency room at my hospital, where I'm on faculty at Georgetown. And she was so dehydrated from all the vomiting. I remember I had her spread out on my bed with a shower curtain. I had a plastic shower curtain on the bed, and I was lying on the bed with her because she just kept vomiting and vomiting and vomiting. So we took her in, and she was so dehydrated at that point, her kidneys were starting to fail, and she was having liver abnormalities. So they admitted her right away and put her on IVs. And despite the fact that they isolated rotavirus and they knew it was a rotavirus infection, they still gave her antibiotics. Why? Antibiotics have zero utility against rotavirus, but it's this whole just in case and not realizing the damage it's doing. So, your microbiome is already taking a hit with a viral infection frequently. And because we've seen it with COVID, with SARS-CoV-2, that the viral infection itself can induce dysbiosis, changes, sort of problematic changes in the microbiome. And then you go and add insult to injury with the antibiotics. So she got IV antibiotics, she got oral antibiotics. And I remember my husband flew back from Guam the day after arriving, which is a long trip. and arrived at the hospital just in time to see her like sitting up in bed, eating an icicle, looking perfectly fine, bounced right back. She'd recovered from the infection. But I remember when we got home, it was like night and day. Like this was a baby who'd been eating, lentil dal burgers and all kinds of food. And all she wanted to eat was sugar. Like she literally turned into a sugar eating monster. I talk about it in the first book, Gut Bliss, after that. And I'm quite sure for me, it was that turning point of the rotavirus and the tons of antibiotics on top of antibiotics in a baby who was C-section, minimally breastfed, et cetera. And it completely changed her palate, like really dramatically. So I wonder with a lot of the kids who are picky eaters, how much of that is correlated. I mean, obviously what they're being fed at home and what they're being introduced to, but I also wonder how much of it is correlated to with antibiotic use early on. So that was my very long answer to why are kids picky eaters. Wouldn't nature favor kids who love veggies and high fiber foods? And, nature does in the sense, Vio, that kids who eat veggies and high fiber foods grow into healthier adults who have fewer autoimmune diseases and allergies, et cetera. So nature is favoring them in that way. But I know what you're saying, right? Like, why doesn't nature sort of make it easier for them to eat that stuff? This is a great question from Cynthia. Hi, Cynthia. How much of the dad's biome do we get? So not a ton. Most of the dad's biome is genetically sort of, we don't think of the microbiome as inherited, but some of it is. So I'll give you an example. There is a bacteria called Senalacea. I love that. I mean, I don't love it as much as I love Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, F. prausnitzii, but Senalacea is probably my number 2 favorite. And Senalacea is a type of bacteria that is inherited as opposed to more acquired based on your diet, environment, et cetera. And it is associated with leanness. So for example, when you see those families of bean poles, like where everybody is just tall and skinny, like, no matter what they do, they all have that same predisposition. Obviously, some of that is what they're eating, and families tend to eat similarly. But some of that can also be through Senalacea, this inherited microbe. Now, here's the thing. You can't just go and borrow some Senalacea from your lean friend because you've got to feed them certain foods, right? So if you take Senalacea, kind of like if you borrow some F. prausnitzii from your vegan friend, but then start to feed it cheeseburgers, it's not going to grow. You're not going to cultivate and really repopulate with that bacteria. But there are some types of bacteria, some families where there seems to be more of an inherited role that is genetic. And we believe some of that also comes from the dad's side. So it's not all on us, but what the mom is eating and the kind of microbiome they're cultivating. I think there should be far more emphasis in the public health world on preparing for conception, not just like eat for 2 and eat whatever you want, but the idea that your baby is inheriting your microbiome. So let's try and make it the healthiest microbiome possible. All right, we have a little more time. Let's go back and see what we have here. One other thing I'd like to talk to you about in terms of origins of our microbiome is just to get back to the food for a minute, because there's so much, I feel like there's so much marketing of the food hold on one sec. Sid, I'm still recording. Sorry, my daughter's on the phone. There's so much marketing of the food in terms of this is good for your microbiome and that is good for your microbiome. And this is a superfood. And, I had a question on Instagram this morning about sea moss and the microbiome. And my answer was, this idea of like superfoods and magical foods and so on, like it is a sum total of what you eat every day. It is that consistency. There's no one magical acai, sea moss superfood. It is literally the choices that you make every day and making sure that you're having a balanced diet and that you're including lots of different plant-based foods. And as I said, there was that recent study that showed variety is really key. It's great if you eat a lot of, broccoli and peas, but if your only vegetable is broccoli and peas, that's not so great. All the different vegetables look and taste different, and they all have different phytonutrients in them, and they all are doing different things for us microbially. So it's important to eat a wide variety. And as I said, that magical number of 31 different plant foods per week. And that would include nuts and seeds as well, right? So you could be, count your sunflower seeds and your oatmeal and your walnuts, et cetera, in addition to your kale and your broccoli and asparagus, et cetera, all the different things. So the variety of food is really key. And, one way to do that is to eat more seasonally, so that as you go through the year, you're eating a wide variety of food as it comes into and out of season. So that's one way to do that. And another way is really thinking about the packaging. If a food comes in a box or package with a list of ingredients, that's not a whole food by definition, right? If you pick up a potato, this is a potato, there's no ingredient list, it's just a potato. That's very different from picking up a bag of potato chips. And now there's, canola oil and sea salt and, several other ingredients. So that's not a whole food anymore. So trying to eat, in addition to it just being sort of greener, trying to not have as much garbage that we have to dispose of, the more you can get out to the farmer's market and buy products where you're literally, here is the turnip, here is the potato, here is a bunch of berries or whatever it is. And it's not a modified version of that food. It's not an applesauce in a cup, because even though the applesauce ingredients may just say applesauce, may just say apples, that applesauce came out of a factory. It didn't come from the apple tree directly. So just trying to think about that a little bit in terms of, the processing of the food is really helpful microbially. So if we don't have, we have a few more questions. I was going to end a little early. And that's such a good one. How about using any type of mouthwash and your microbiome? Yes, that's a great one. So many of the mouthwashes have triclosan in them. Triclosan was banned from certain products by the FDA a few years ago, but not all. And in addition to being an endocrine disruptor, it's also a microbiome disruptor. And, all this stuff in the mouthwash about how it kills bacteria. Yes, it means your microbes that it's killing, right? So mouthwash is a really bad idea. It's kind of like hand sanitizer, just use some soap and water and wash your hands really well. And, you can just rinse your mouth. The toothpaste already has stuff in it. So the mouthwash is really an unnecessary second step. And there's a lot of data actually that mouthwash is very deleterious to the microbiome. So I would lose the mouthwash. Okay. Any concern about C. diff in soil? Robin, that's so interesting. So Clostridium difficile, as many of you know, is a bacteria that actually many of us are colonized with, and we have it in low levels in our gut. But when we take an antibiotic, it kills off a lot of the healthy bacteria. And now the C. diff proliferate. You can also catch it. There's a lot of it in the hospitals. But a lot of the C. diff that we're seeing is not hospital acquired, where somebody's getting the Clostridium difficile bacteria from a contaminated patient or staff member. It is community acquired, where we have it in low levels in our gut. And when we take an antibiotic, we kill off the healthy bacteria and the C. diff proliferates. And so that's now where we're seeing a lot of the C. diff. C. diff in soil from food is really not a significant public health problem the way E. coli and other things are, even though it may be in there. And that's probably because we're not ingesting enough of it. But, if you have an exposure that way and you're also on antibiotics, that could potentially add up. Thoughts on collagen added to diet and smoothies. So we did a really nice review in Gut Bliss, and we've restored the old Gut Bliss blog, by the way, putting out a new edition in another week or two. So we're very excited to have that old Gut Bliss site back up, because it was such a good site, actually, I have to say. And I give full credit to Leslie Ann Berg, my chief of operations, who puts that together. I mean, we work together on the articles, but she gets the whole thing up. So if you go to the Gut Bliss site, gutbliss.com, and you put in collagen, we did a product review about a year and a half ago on collagen. It was really fascinating, because the bottom line is there is zero evidence for any of these supplements, but there's some really interesting stuff you can do with food in terms of collagen levels, right? So adding marine collagen, adding those powders to smoothies and so on is not only not doing anything for you, but also potentially a bad idea, because there are typically other chemicals and things in these supplements. It's probably one of the biggest causes I see for GI distress in a lot of the patients in my office, is that they're doing all these protein powders and collagen supplements and so on, and it's upsetting their gut. So take a look at the review, and in there's some really good natural ways to increase collagen through food. And we are completely non-denominational. We don't have any commercial relationships with any product company, et cetera. So it allows us to be very unbiased and fair in these product reviews. And there are a lot of links to all the articles in there. So it's a sort of very scientifically based review, and I think you'd find it interesting. I also want to make a little plug for one of our courses that we're launching on January 25th, Drug-Free IBD. And this is something that I've been doing in my practice for decades, really, is helping patients with Crohn's and ulcerative colitis get off of immunosuppressive medications like biologics and steroids, et cetera. But even if you're not on one of these medications, and perhaps even if you don't have inflammatory bowel disease, but you have another autoimmune disease, really interesting data on the role of diet and lifestyle changes. And my approach is never like these drugs are bad and must be avoided. My approach is always judicious use of these drugs. Let's make sure you really need them. Let's understand what they're really doing. And really trying to educate people so that they can be good advocates with their healthcare practitioners for the kind of care that they are more interested in receiving. So I think we're going to call it a day today. Let me see if we have one more question on the chat. Is a drug-free IBD course intended for both patients and professionals? Absolutely, it is. It is intended for both, and it is a prequel, if you will, to our integrative GI certification that we're going to be launching later this year, but is absolutely designed for both patients and professionals. And we really hope you join us. You can sign up on the Gut Bliss site or digestivecenterforwellness.com. So digestive center for FOR wellness.com, but it's also at the bottom of the homepage on the Gut Bliss site. And I am so proud of this course. I'm so excited to share it. It's 4 weeks. So each week you will get, there's a workbook that you'll get the week before the course starts, divided into 4 sections. And then each week you'll get an audio lesson. And then the following week, there's a live Q&A with the group, and we're limiting the group to keep it nice and small with the group and myself, where we can really get into the nitty-gritty of the questions, and people can ask questions about their specific history, et cetera, as well as send questions in ahead of time. And again, I cannot wait to get started on it. It's going to be really, really fun being able to work with people more closely. So if you're interested, sign up. If you know somebody who's interested, please tell them about it. All right, thanks. Well, I think that's all I have today for Origins of the Microbiome. Next week, we have, let's see what we have coming up next week. What causes inflammatory bowel disease? How timely. And then the week after that, I think we have diverticulosis on the 25th. And then on February 1st, we have the bloated versus belly fat that I had to postpone from last week. I'm so sorry, but it was in the early days of my COVID adventure and I really wasn't feeling too well. So we'll catch you in the beginning of February for that one. All right, everybody.